September 15, 1944. Aero 8:32 hours. White Beach 2, Peleliu Island. The first wave of United States Marines struck the coral shore under a sky bleached white by heat and smoke. The landing craft ramps dropped with metallic thunder, and men poured onto a beach that wasn't sand but pulverized coral, sharp as broken glass, gleaming like bone fragments in the tropical sun. The air tasted of sulfur and salt. Above them, the ridges of Peleliu rose like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, limestone cliffs pocked with caves that exhaled darkness even at midday. Within those shadows, 13,000 Japanese soldiers waited in silence, their rifles trained on the shoreline, their fingers resting on triggers, connected to a network of fortifications more sophisticated than anything the Americans had yet encountered. In the Pacific War, Captain Raymond Davis of the 1st Marine Regiment felt the heat before he felt the bullets. It was a physical presence, this heat, a crushing weight that pressed down on every man as they scrambled across the exposed beach toward the airfield that lay 400 yards inland. The temperature that morning had already climbed past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside their wool uniforms and beneath their steel helmets, the Marines began to cook. But the heat was not their enemy. Not yet. Not when the machine gun fire began to rake across the beach in systematic sweeps. When mortar rounds began to fall with such precision that men understood immediately they were not fighting an opponent, but an equation, a mathematical certainty of death calculated in advance and executed with industrial efficiency. The objective was simple in conception, impossible in execution. Seize the airfield. The airfield on Peleliu was the reason 12,000 Marines had been hurled against this insignificant speck of coral in the western Pacific, this island measuring barely 6 square miles. This place whose name most Americans could not pronounce and whose location they could not find on any map in their homes. But to the strategists in Pearl Harbor and Washington, Peleliu's airfield represented the key to General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Japanese aircraft operating from this strip could threaten the entire invasion fleet. The island had to be taken. The airfield had to be held. The operation was predicted to last 4 days, perhaps 5 at most. It would consume 2 months and become one of the most savage battles in Marine Corps history, a campaign with a casualty rate that exceeded even Iwo Jima when measured as a percentage of forces engaged. But on that first morning, as the Marines crossed the beach and entered the shattered palm groves beyond, they knew only their immediate task. Push inland. Take the airfield. Hold it until relieved. These were men of the 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, soldiers who had learned to fight in jungles and swamps, who expected an enemy that would charge screaming from the tree line in suicidal banzai attacks that could be cut down with disciplined fire. They expected humidity and disease and the slow grinding attrition of tropical warfare. They expected to be afraid but competent, to be tested but ultimately victorious within the predicted time frame. They did not expect what Peleliu actually was. They did not expect to enter a furnace. By noon on September 15th, elements of the 5th Marine Regiment had reached the southern edge of the airfield, a flat expanse of crushed coral stretching nearly a mile across the island's narrow waist. It was utterly exposed, a killing ground without cover, overlooked on 3 sides by the ridges where Japanese gunners sat in reinforced concrete bunkers carved 30 feet deep into the limestone. Colonel Harold "Bucky" Harris, commanding the 5th Marines, understood immediately that taking the airfield was one thing. Holding it would be something else entirely. His men dug into the coral with entrenching tools that sparked against the stone. They scraped shallow depressions that barely qualified as foxholes. And when the counterattack came that night, when Japanese tanks rolled out of the darkness accompanied by infantry carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges, the Marines learned what it meant to hold ground, not because reinforcements were coming, but because there was nowhere else to go. The history of military operations is filled with moments of isolated defense, with small units cut off and surrounded who hold their positions through some combination of courage and desperation. But Peleliu was different. The Marines on that airfield were not cut off by enemy action. They were cut off by design, by the terrible geometry of the island itself, and by decisions made at command levels so far removed from the coral and the heat that the men doing the dying could scarcely comprehend them. The landing had been opposed with such ferocity that the beaches remained under fire for days. Supplies came ashore in chaos. Water cans, punctured by shrapnel, leaked their precious contents into the coral. Ammunition was plentiful, but food was scarce. Medical supplies ran low within hours, as the casualties mounted with shocking speed. And reinforcements, the fresh troops who were supposed to pass through the front lines and allow the assault units to rotate back for rest, those reinforcements were committed instead to a dozen other desperate actions across the island, to reducing cave systems in the ridges, to fighting in a landscape that seemed designed by some malevolent intelligence to maximize human suffering. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 5th Marines, would later write that Peleliu was the closest thing to hell he could imagine. He wrote of the coral dust that filled every breath, that turned sweat into a gray paste coating the skin, that mixed with gunpowder residue and blood, until every Marine looked like a ghost sculpted from ash. He wrote of the thirst, the consuming thirst that made men hallucinate, that drove them to drink from shell craters where rainwater mixed with the runoff from decaying corpses. He wrote of the smell, the overwhelming stench of death that hung over the island like a physical presence, that saturated clothing and equipment until even years later the scent memory could return unbidden and complete. But most of all, Sledge wrote of the airfield, of those days when his unit held positions on that exposed coral flat, while Japanese artillery ranged in from the heights, when to move during daylight was to die, and to remain still was to slowly dissolve under the weight of heat and fear. What the Marines expected when they landed on Peleliu was a tough fight, followed by relief. What they experienced was abandonment, not through malice, but through miscalculation so profound it bordered on criminal negligence. Intelligence had estimated the Japanese garrison at 10,000 men. They had undercounted by 3,000. Intelligence had predicted the enemy would fight using conventional tactics, defending the beaches and counterattacking en masse. Instead, the Japanese had learned from their defeats at Tarawa and Saipan. They had abandoned the doctrine of dying gloriously at the water's edge. Under the command of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, they had transformed Peleliu into a fortress in depth, had turned every ridge and cave into an interlocking network of defensive positions designed not to repel the invasion, but to bleed it white, to make every yard cost so dearly that the Americans would finally understand that the price of defeating Japan would be measured in casualties beyond endurance. On the airfield, the Marines who held the perimeter lived in increments of darkness. Daylight meant exposure to sniper fire so accurate that men learned to time their movements to the rhythm of artillery barrages, to move only when smoke and dust obscured the ridgelines, to sprint between positions knowing that half would make it and half would not, and there was no way to predict which half you belonged to. Water was rationed to a canteen per day, sometimes less. The cans of K-rations, when they came at all, were so hot from sitting in the sun that the cheese and meat spreads liquefied. Men punctured the cans with bayonets and sucked out the contents, burning their lips on metal heated to temperatures that could blister skin. At night, the temperature dropped, but the terror increased. The Japanese owned the darkness. They infiltrated the lines with such skill that sentries sometimes died without making a sound, throats cut by attackers who appeared and vanished like smoke. On the fourth day, when the battle was supposed to be ending, when American flags were supposed to be flying over a secured island, the Marines on the airfield received an order that contained just 3 words: "Hold until relieved." No timeline was specified. No date was promised. The reinforcements that were supposed to pass through their lines had been redirected to the Umurbrogel pocket, the nightmarish complex of ridges and caves the Marines had begun calling Bloody Nose Ridge. Thousands of Japanese soldiers occupied those heights, and reducing the positions would require not days but weeks of fighting so intense that entire companies would cease to exist as functional units. Their rosters reduced from 200 men to 20 in the span of 72 hours. The airfield would have to hold with what it had. The men already there would have to be enough. They were not enough. Not by any rational calculation. Captain Davis's company had landed with 235 Marines. By the end of the first week, he commanded 97 effectives. Casualties were not replaced. Men who fell sick from heat exhaustion were treated in place if possible, or evacuated only if unconscious. The defensive perimeter contracted not by tactical choice, but by mathematical necessity as the number of rifles available to hold it diminished. Japanese artillery observers in the ridges could see every position, could direct fire with such precision that foxholes became tombs. The Marines learned to dig deeper, to excavate the coral with their bare hands when their tools broke, to pile dead bodies as sandbags because the only thing plentiful on Peleliu was corpses. American corpses were handled with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, wrapped in ponchos and dragged to collection points behind the lines. Japanese corpses were pushed into shell craters or left where they fell because there were too many, and the living could barely manage to bury their own. In the annals of the Pacific War, historians would later document with clinical precision the failures of planning that characterized Operation Stalemate II, the code name for the Peleliu invasion. They would note that Admiral William Halsey had recommended canceling the entire operation, that he had argued the island could be bypassed, that its strategic value was negligible compared to the cost of taking it. They would record that his recommendations were overruled by commanders who had already committed resources and pride to the operation, who could not conceive of leaving enemy-held territory in their rear even if that territory posed no meaningful threat. They would analyze the intelligence failures, the inadequate naval gunfire preparation, the lack of contingency planning for protracted operations. But none of these analyses would capture what it meant to be 20 years old and lying in a shallow scrape in the coral while artillery rounds walked across the airfield in sequence, to hear the scream of incoming shells and know with absolute certainty that this one or the next one or the one after that would land directly on your position, and there was nothing you could do but press your face into the coral and pray to a god who seemed to have abandoned this particular island to the jurisdiction of physics and chemistry and the brutal mathematics of high explosives, the symbol of American abundance. On Peleliu was not cigarettes or Coca-Cola or any of the luxuries that usually represented home to servicemen overseas. The symbol was water, more specifically, the absence of water. Men fixated on it. They dreamed of it. They hallucinated streams and fountains and the cool darkness of wells. The irony was not lost on the Marines that they were fighting on an island surrounded by ocean, that infinite water stretched to every horizon, that they could see it from their positions, a blue shimmer beyond the coral, and yet they were dying of thirst. Salt water mocked them. It was everywhere and useless. Some men, driven beyond reason by heat and thirst, tried to drink it anyway. They vomited and their dehydration worsened, and sometimes they died not from enemy fire, but from the simple physiological fact that the human body cannot process salt water, that evolution did not equip mammals to survive in an environment where water is abundant but undrinkable. Contrast this with what the Japanese soldiers in the ridges experienced. They had prepared for siege. Their caves contained stockpiles of food and water, rice and canned goods, and barrels of drinking water hauled into position before the battle began. They were hot, but not dying of thirst. They were hungry, but not starving. The Americans below them on the airfield, the conquerors who came from a nation of such wealth that it could project power across 6,000 miles of ocean, were reduced to sucking moisture from cactus plants, to licking condensation from the inside of their helmets at dawn, to rationing sips from canteens with such miserly discipline that men went mad from the psychological torture of having water available but forbidden. The Japanese had learned a crucial lesson about fighting Americans. Do not meet their material abundance with equal abundance. Meet it instead with deprivation. Force them to fight without the supply lines that are their greatest strength. Make them understand that all the industrial might of Detroit and Pittsburgh means nothing when you are pinned down on a coral airfield and the water truck cannot reach you because the road is under machine gun fire. By September 23rd, 8 days into a battle predicted to last 4, the situation on the airfield had stabilized in the same sense that a man drowning in slow motion can be said to be stable. He is not sinking faster, but neither is he rising toward air. The perimeter held because it had contracted to the absolute minimum size that could be defended. The Marines held because they had nowhere to retreat to, and because the alternative to holding was dying in the attempt to withdraw across terrain so exposed that even the wounded could not be evacuated during daylight. The wounded lay in the sun and cooked. Corpsmen did what they could with dwindling supplies of morphine and bandages. Plasma, the blood product that saved thousands of lives in other battles, was often useless on Peleliu because it was stored in glass bottles that shattered during the beach landings, because the bottles that survived were too hot to inject safely, because dehydrated men lacked the circulatory volume to make transfusion effective anyway. The Journal of Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, records his growing fury at the situation. Puller was a warrior in the old style, a man who led from the front and expected his superiors to provide him with the resources necessary to accomplish assigned missions. On Peleliu, those resources never materialized in sufficient quantity. He requested relief for his decimated battalions. He was told to hold. He requested additional water and medical supplies. He was told supplies were en route. But the ships offshore were still unloading in chaos, still sorting equipment, still trying to establish the logistics pipeline that should have been functioning on day 2, but which remained broken on day 10. Puller's regiment would ultimately suffer 70% casualties on Peleliu. His own headquarters company would be virtually annihilated. And through it all, the message from higher command remained consistent. Hold until relieved. The reinforcements never came because there were no reinforcements available. Every unit on Peleliu was committed. Every man who could hold a rifle was already on the line. The transformation that occurred among the Marines on that airfield was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, a slow erosion of everything they had believed about warfare and their place in it. They had come to Peleliu as members of an elite force, as Marines who represented the sharp edge of American military power, who expected to fight hard but to be supported, to be valued, to be extracted when the mission was complete. They learned instead that they were expendable in the most literal sense, that the mission was the only thing that mattered, that their lives had value only insofar as they contributed to holding those acres of coral that comprised the airfield. This was not an indictment of their officers, most of whom shared the same privations and died at even higher rates. It was a recognition of the essential nature of war, stripped of ideology and patriotism and all the comforting narratives that civilian populations construct to make the deaths of young men meaningful. On Peleliu, the truth was simpler and more terrible. You held because to not hold meant other men would die, taking the same ground again. You endured because endurance was the only remaining option, and you did not expect relief because expectation led to hope, and hope, in that place, was a luxury more precious and more dangerous than water. The sound that defined Peleliu was not gunfire, though there was plenty of that. It was the sound of coral crunching under boots, under tank treads, under falling bodies. The island was made of ancient coral reef uplifted by tectonic forces, limestone riddled with caves and sharp as razors. When shells exploded, they created clouds of coral dust that hung in the still air for hours. Men breathed it constantly. It infiltrated lungs and caused a condition the doctors called coral cough, a persistent hacking that brought up gray phlegm and sometimes blood. The dust got into weapons and caused malfunctions. It got into food and crunched between teeth. It mixed with sweat and formed a caustic paste that caused skin ulcers. And always, that sound of crunching, of an entire island being slowly ground to powder by the passage of armies. In the years after the war, veterans of Peleliu would report that they could not walk on gravel paths, that the sound triggered memories so vivid that they would freeze in place. Transported instantly back to that coral airfield to September 1944, to days when every hour felt like a week, and the only measurement of time that mattered was whether you had survived to see another sunset. On September 30th, 15 days after the landing, 2 weeks after the battle was supposed to be over, the Army's 81st Infantry Division finally captured the southern islands of the Palau Group and began relieving Marine units on Peleliu itself. But the relief was partial and painfully slow. The Umurbrogol pocket remained unconquered. The ridges still contained thousands of Japanese soldiers who would continue fighting for another 6 weeks. The airfield remained under artillery fire, though with decreasing frequency. When the Army troops arrived to take over portions of the perimeter, the Marines they replaced were barely recognizable as human beings. They had lost an average of 30 pounds per man. Their uniforms hung in rags. Their eyes stared from faces coated in coral dust and grime, eyes that had seen too much and no longer properly focused on the present. Many could not speak coherently. They had to be led by the hand to the beach, to the landing craft that would take them to the transport ships offshore, to hot meals and clean water and bunks where they could sleep without fear of infiltrators cutting their throats. Private Sledge described the relief as dreamlike, as though he was watching himself from outside his own body, unable to believe that he was actually leaving the airfield, that he had survived when so many had not. He wrote of the guilt, the overwhelming guilt of being alive while his friends were dead, while their bodies were still lying in the coral, or buried in hasty graves marked with rifles stuck bayonet first into the ground and dog tags hanging from the stocks. He wrote of the disconnect between what he had endured and the world that awaited him, a world where people complained about rationing and long lines at movie theaters, where the war was an abstraction discussed in newspapers over breakfast, where no one could possibly understand what it meant to hold an airfield on Peleliu when reinforcements never came. The final casualty. Figures for the Battle of Peleliu tell a story that statistics alone cannot capture. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6,526 casualties out of approximately 10,000 men engaged, a casualty rate of over 65%. The 5th Marine Regiment, which bore the brunt of the fighting on the airfield, was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Some companies were reduced to fewer than 20 men. The Japanese garrison of approximately 13,000 soldiers was annihilated. Fewer than 300 surrendered. The rest died in their caves or were buried alive when flamethrowers and demolition teams sealed the cave entrances. The airfield, the objective that had justified the entire operation, was operational by late September. American aircraft began using it in early October. Historians continue to debate whether those flights, whether the ability to base fighters and bombers on Peleliu justified the cost. Most conclude it did not. The island could have been bypassed. The Philippines invasion proceeded on schedule with or without Peleliu secured. Thousands of men died to take an objective of marginal strategic value because once the operation had begun, institutional momentum made cancellation impossible. But to focus solely on the strategic level is to miss the deeper truth of Peleliu, the truth that emerged from those days on the airfield when Marines held because holding was all they could do. The American military is built on assumptions of material superiority, on the belief that logistical excellence and industrial capacity can overcome any tactical disadvantage. Peleliu inverted those assumptions. It demonstrated that even the wealthiest and most powerful nation on Earth could not guarantee that its soldiers would be properly supported. The promises of relief and reinforcement sometimes meant nothing. That rhetoric about leaving no man behind was sometimes just rhetoric. The Marines who held that airfield learned self-reliance in its purest and most terrible form. They learned that at the absolute extreme, survival depends not on the system or the supply chain or the institution, but on the man next to you in the foxhole, on the small unit cohesion that binds men together when everything else has failed. The recurring symbol that veterans of Peleliu carried forward was not a physical object, but a concept. Enough. They learned the minimum threshold of enough. Enough water to keep a man conscious. Enough ammunition to hold a perimeter. Enough morphine to dull the worst of the pain. Enough courage to face another day when you have already exceeded every reasonable definition of enough. In the American imagination, abundance is birthright. The nation's founding mythology celebrates plenty, celebrates the endless frontier and the unlimited opportunity and the conviction that more is always possible. Peleliu taught a different lesson. It taught that abundance is not guaranteed, that there are places where the supply lines break down, where promises of support dissolve in the heat and chaos of battle, where men must make do with less than enough and still accomplish the mission. This was not a lesson the American public wanted to learn. It did not fit the narrative of inevitable victory powered by Detroit's assembly lines and Midwest farms. It suggested instead that victory was contingent, that it required not just materials, but sacrifice of a depth that comfortable civilians preferred not to contemplate. The caves on Peleliu continued to disgorge. Japanese soldiers for months after organized resistance officially ended. Some emerged to surrender, driven by starvation and thirst. Others emerged to fight, launching suicidal attacks against American positions with samurai swords and grenades. The very last Japanese holdout on Peleliu, a lieutenant named A. Yamaguchi and 33 soldiers under his command, did not surrender until April 1947. More than 2 years after the war ended. They emerged from a cave complex on the northern ridges, emaciated but alive, having survived on stored supplies and rainwater, and the conviction that to surrender was to dishonor emperor and nation. When American officers informed them that Japan had lost the war, that the emperor himself had ordered all military forces to lay down their arms, Lieutenant Yamaguchi wept. Then he surrendered. The story of those holdouts circulated among the Marines who had fought on Peleliu, and it produced not hatred, but a strange respect. The Japanese soldiers in those caves had endured the same hell of heat and isolation, had suffered the same deprivation, had held their positions without hope of relief or reinforcement. The difference was one of ideology rather than courage. The Japanese fought for emperor and nation and the honor of death before surrender. The Americans fought for each other and for home and for the belief that if they could just hold on long enough, the system would eventually function as promised. The supplies would arrive. The reinforcements would come. Both beliefs were tested to destruction on Peleliu. The Japanese lost because their ideology demanded they die rather than adapt. The Americans nearly lost because their ideology promised support that never materialized. In the end, the side that won was the side that could endure longer, and endurance had nothing to do with justice or righteousness or the superiority of one political system over another. Endurance was about water and ammunition, and the will to live when death was easier. The airfield on Peleliu still exists. The runways are cracked and overgrown but visible from the air. The jungle has reclaimed much of the island, but in the dry season, you can still see the scars, the shell craters, and the collapsed bunkers, and the rusted remains of tanks and landing craft. The beaches where the Marines landed are peaceful now, popular with the few tourists who make the journey to this remote island in the western Pacific. The caves in the ridges are sealed or collapsed, but some remain accessible, and guides who take visitors into them warn about unexploded ordnance and the bones that occasionally surface after heavy rains. There is a museum on the island, a small building that houses artifacts and photographs, and a list of the dead. The list is very long, for the men who held that airfield in September 1944, who endured heat and thirst and the constant presence of death, who learned that reinforcements never came because there were no reinforcements to send. Peleliu remained a reference point for the rest of their lives. It was the measure against which all subsequent hardship was judged and found wanting. Nothing would ever be as hot as Peleliu. No thirst would ever be as consuming. No fear would ever be as pure. They did not speak of it often, these veterans. When they did, it was usually late at night, with men who had been there, who understood without need for explanation. They spoke of holding not because they were ordered to, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Of finding reserves of strength they did not know existed. Of watching friends die and continuing to function because the mission required it. They spoke of learning that freedom is not free in the abstract patriotic sense, but in the specific and terrible sense that someone must pay the cost, must stand in the gap, must hold the line when every rational calculation says holding is impossible. The larger truth that emerged from Peleliu was this: American abundance, American material superiority, American technological advantage. None of it guaranteed victory, and all of it could fail when logistics and planning broke down. What remained when the systems failed was the individual soldier or Marine, the small unit, the squad and platoon, and company that had to function without support, because support was not coming. The ideology of democracy could inspire men to enlist and deploy, but it could not keep them alive on a coral airfield under artillery fire. What kept them alive was training and discipline, and luck, and most of all the bonds between men who had endured the same impossible situation and refused to abandon each other even when their institution had effectively abandoned them. Peleliu broke something in the American military's confidence. It demonstrated that even the best troops could be ground down, that casualty rates of 60% and 70% were possible in modern warfare, that technological superiority meant nothing in terrain where every yard had to be taken with rifles and grenades and the bodies of infantrymen. The lessons learned on Peleliu would influence American tactics for the rest of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be approached with greater respect for Japanese defensive capabilities, with better preparation, with more realistic timelines. But those lessons came too late for the Marines who held the airfield when reinforcements never came, who learned through experience what should have been understood through planning. That some objectives are not worth the cost, that some battles should not be fought, that the true measure of military leadership is knowing when to commit forces and when to walk away. September 15, 1944 to November 27, 1944. 74 days. That was how long it took to declare Peleliu secured. The airfield was operational after 3 weeks, but the island continued to bleed Marines and soldiers for 2 more months as the cave systems were reduced one by one. And through it all, the question that no one could adequately answer: was it worth it? Did the flights that operated from Peleliu, did the strategic benefit of denying the Japanese that base, did any of it justify the cost? The official histories say yes, because official histories are written by institutions that cannot admit fundamental error. The veterans say no, or they say nothing at all, because the question itself is obscene, because it suggests that their friends died for a reason, when the truth is they died because men in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away made calculations that proved catastrophically wrong. The Marines held the airfield on Peleliu because they were ordered to hold it, and because honor and discipline and the bonds of brotherhood are stronger than the survival instinct. They held it when reinforcements never came because no other option existed that did not involve betraying everything they believed about themselves and each other. They held it at a cost that should shame every officer who planned the operation and every commander who refused to cancel it when the casualty reports began to arrive. And they held it knowing, eventually, that their sacrifice would be minimized and forgotten, that Peleliu would become a footnote in histories of the Pacific War, overshadowed by Iwo Jima and Okinawa, reduced to statistics and maps and strategic analyses that miss entirely what it meant to be there, to endure, to survive. The last thought belongs to the dead, to the thousands who never left that island, whose bones are still there beneath the coral and jungle. They held the airfield without reinforcement because someone had to, because the mission required it, because walking away was impossible once the first man had died. Their reward was death on a forgotten island in a battle that should never have been fought. Their legacy is the knowledge, bitter and pure, that sometimes the only thing supporting you is the man beside you, that sometimes reinforcements never come, that sometimes holding is all that matters and all you can do. This is the truth of Peleliu. This is what it means to stand alone together, to endure the unendurable, to discover that when everything else fails, when promises break and systems collapse and abundance reveals itself as illusion, what remains is the choice to hold or to break. And that choice, repeated across thousands of individual moments of terror and pain, is what transforms ordinary men into something harder and sadder and more true than any ideology could ever make them.